Welcome to a 2025 brand new first edition Legal AF Meets Court Accountability Action. And of course, your hosts for this hot take on everything John Roberts and the new end of year report. We got Lisa Graves, we got Alex Aronson, and of course, Michael Popok. So every year, let me frame this and I'm going to turn it over to the experts. Every year, the Chief Justice has one opportunity to say what keeps him up at night and talk directly to the American people about the state of the judiciary in an end of the year like annual report. And we all wait for it. It's like, for us geeks and nerds, it's very exciting when we see how does he see what happened in the last year? I wonder. Now, if you were speculating or you were running a sports book, you might think in a year where we had an immunity decision that upset the balance of power and the three co-equal branches of government, you had a Supreme Court justice who along with his wife, flew flags of insurrection in front of their homes. You had millions of dollars of undisclosed gifts. I would call them bribes going to Clarence Thomas. You had Sam Alito falling in love with monarchists all around the world and bringing that into his jurisprudence. You would think that maybe, with all the ethical crises, maybe he would talk about that. Nope. No. So Alex and Lisa, it was the four threats. I thought this was going to be like the four freedoms of Eisenhower or whatever, like the four threats against the independent judiciary, most of which look like an indictment of Donald Trump without calling him by name. And then this last one about his real fear is that the incoming Trump administration is really going to be lawless because he made it so and won't respect any of the judiciary decrees that are coming out from the cases. And then where are we? So why don't we turn it over to you guys? You guys read it cover to cover. So did I, with all the beautiful pictures and prosaic statements, pictures of Earl Warren and whoever else was in there. I don't even know what was in there to try to give it legitimacy. Why am I so hot about this?
Lisa, I'm going to let you kick it off. I've been, checking out some of the comments on our videos. One commenter observed that it seems like Alex, in our few months of doing these videos with you, Popok, that Alex's beard is getting grayer and grayer by the day, and it is reports like this that is doing that. So I'm gonna let Lisa kick us off because she is the real.
I started this channel 3 months ago, and mine was as darker than yours. Now look at me.
That's hilarious. My husband.
It's like the president. It's the president over time effect.
My husband, who I met when he was 19, says he didn't have any gray hair until he met me, which is true. But it came much later. No, thanks, Alex. Thanks for passing the baton to me. So, as Michael said, this is the annual report of the Chief Justice, and we knew it was going to be a whitewashing job. That's why Alex and I, through Court Accountability and our Tilted Scales newsletter, got out a pre-buttal because we knew that Roberts was going to continue his PR campaign, ignore reality, and try to spin things, which is what he's now really, thankfully, now he's really finally known for it. For the longest time, he had the highest approval rating of all the officials in Washington. It was really discouraging to see that, given the role that he's played in really destroying fundamental areas of the law, voting rights, the maps, fair maps, the campaign finance decisions and more. And so now finally, over these last 2 years, the mask has fallen and people can really see what John Roberts is up to. And then to have him issue this report, which, really basically ignores what actually happened in terms of the plummeting support for the court and why it's happening. Instead, he attempts to, in some ways, equate criticism with almost terrorism or threats to judges. I think Alex, I'd love for you to talk about this. I think it's fundamentally an authoritarian response by this Chief Justice, because instead of actually acknowledging the reality, which is that this court has faced an incredibly compelling just depiction in the media of how it has gone off the rails. Instead of responding to that, John Roberts basically tries to say the courts are under attack and there's illegitimate criticism of the court. And in fact, what there's been is finally a light shining on the court, and the actual corruption that has surrounded that court has been documented by journalists numerous journalists, and instead of addressing that, which he refused to do, refused to appear before the Judiciary Committee and more, instead he wants to criticize the critics. So what do you think about that, Alex?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And Popok, I think you're on the nail too, in terms of some messages he's very clearly trying to send to Trump. Let's walk through these 4 threats that he describes as 4 areas of illegitimate activity. They're violence, intimidation, disinformation, and threats to defy lawfully entered judgments. And he walks through a number of very scary incidents of violence that have involved judges. Of course, there was a really horrific massacre of a judge's family in New Jersey that led to vital legislation, bipartisan legislation that I helped work on when I was in the Senate to improve security for judges. And then, I think the intimidation arguments are, certainly less fleshed out. And then, as you say, Lisa, he sort of makes this transition to this third category, disinformation, of which he gives 0 examples. And here he makes the very clear connection between what he's saying is an illegitimate criticism of the court. And he says this, actually. He says that public officials who regrettably engaged in recent attempts to intimidate judges, for example, suggesting political bias in the judge's adverse rulings without a credible basis for such allegations. I mean, that itself is disinformation. And I think it speaks to the extent to which, John Roberts really views himself and his colleagues there, his Republican colleagues at the court, as the only source of legitimacy. And the idea that leveling criticism, public criticism of these justices, of their rulings, their facially unsound, unprincipled rulings with proven connections to corrupt partisan activity, to corrupt fiscal sponsorship of the justices' lifestyles, to say that they are illegitimate, to say that they are without basis in evidence, is itself an act of disinformation. And then to take the further step of suggesting, as Roberts does, that it's these criticisms that have led to the violence, to the intimidation against judges, is really beyond the pale and galling to my mind. I mean, without any acknowledgement of the underlying conduct, without any self-awareness at all of the examples you mentioned, Popok, the flags that Alito was wearing outside of his house, or the many millions of dollars in gifts that Clarence Thomas received from billionaires with interests before the court. As if outcomes like Dobbs and the stripping away of women's fundamental freedoms in this country were not, itself a part of this heightened politicization, heightened polarization around the courts, is really, I think, reflects this air of arrogance and impunity that the court has really started to manifest.
I'll go further. If a company issued an annual report like this, ignoring all the material facts of what happened to it or what it caused during the prior year, they would be both indicted and sued for securities fraud.
Right.
I mean, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that right. Yeah. You'd be like, "What? Oh, I wonder what happened at the Supreme Court Incorporated. Oh, that's interesting." And everything that I read, I'm going to read a couple of parts of it. Most of it was apparently a thinly veiled criticism of Donald Trump. And what seems to be keeping Roberts up at night is that he created a Leviathan. He created a rampaging Frankenstein that he can't control, and he's worried he's going to flout any of the orders that he doesn't like into the future. Because in order for this thing to work, as he pointed to Little Rock and Brown versus the Board of Education and desegregation, in order for this to work, the executive branch has to recognize and execute on the orders of the court, because the court doesn't have its own cops. The court doesn't have its own police. John Roberts says, do that. He doesn't have like an army to go do it. You need an FBI director. You need a Department of Justice Attorney General. Who's that going to be? Kash Patel? Pam Bondi? Who, Harmeet Dillon for civil rights? Who? I know we all laugh at that, but, and I know Harmeet from a case, but yeah, no. So the answer is no, and he's worried about that. So listen to some of these. I'm going to skip all of the oil painting stuff the Renoir masters.
The oil painting stuff, the introduction, the allusions to King George and his declaration that the colonial courts, were going to serve at the pleasure of the king. He's claiming that as the threat upon which
he just created that.
No,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
He just created the thing that we ran from.
It's astounding.
Yeah,
all right,
I have no doubt. I've said this aloud. If we were able to do a seance with the framers and the founding fathers, exhumed them and told them and laid out what just happened at the United States Supreme Court and otherwise, they would say, what? I mean, I don't know. I don't really know what the colonial verbiage would. What the fuck just happened? Okay. And so here's what he said on some, and I also think he's prejudged the TikTok case, which Lisa and I are going to talk about later, because he made a comment about he's worried about foreign misinformation campaigns and its impact. He says on the judiciary, but I don't know. That doesn't sound great for TikTok on the 10th of January. But here's what he said, and every time I read it, I was like, "This is Trump." Today, in the computer era, intimidation can take different forms of the judiciary. Disappointed litigants rage at judicial decisions on the internet, urging readers to send a message to the judge. They falsely claim the judge had it in for them because of the judge's race, gender, or ethnicity, or the political party of the president who appointed the judge. Some of them some messages promote violence. For example, setting things on fire or blowing them up. I'm like, well, which person in the last year or two has done that? And his name's not Joe Biden. It's not Menendez. It's not Hunter Biden. It's Donald Trump. He goes on and says public officials, regrettably, have engaged in attempts to intimidate judges. Yes, I agree about their adverse rulings. So it's not like they can't write that. Nothing's accidental, right? Nothing's a slip of the pen or the fingers. So it's there on purpose. So he's basically trying in his own way to say, we see you, Donald Trump. We see your attacks on the judiciary and we don't like it. While he's at the start of it, insulting the American people's intelligence and telling us we're not bright enough or good enough to criticize the judiciary. Right? He doesn't just say, in the beginning, he says, well, the First Amendment allows you to do it. But then he basically says that a lot of this interference, let me see if I get the exact quote here. Unfortunately, I love this. Here we go. This is on page 5. Unfortunately, not all actors, that's you and me, engage in informed criticism or anything remotely resembling it. I feel compelled to address. So that's a criticism of the American people criticizing the judiciary, right? Then he just goes on and on. So what if you're trying to be a psychologist for the psychosis that has overcome Roberts? What do you make of him talking about his abuser in the language that he's using in Donald Trump? And what is that supposed to be telling us about where the court is at when it comes to cases? And there's going to be dozens of them in front of the court in 2025 into 2026 as we watch a lawless president lurch from one constitutional crisis to the next.
Well, I think that Roberts has cleverly written that response on sort of two different valences. One is, about Trump, but one is also about the Democrats. How dare the House members, file a bill of impeachment or the baseline resolution for impeachment? How dare they write letters to the court and say these justices, Alito and Thomas, should recuse themselves? Obviously, they're in violation of longstanding federal statute that mandates, with mandatory language, that a justice shall recuse themselves if they have a bias or there's an appearance of bias. And yet he doesn't address those things at all because he needed those votes to do what he did, which was to basically hand the presidency to Donald Trump. What John Roberts orchestrated this past year in 2024 through three different Supreme Court decisions, the Colorado case, the immunity case, and the Fisher case involving the charges against some of the people who attacked the Capitol, fans of Trump, trying to stop the Electoral College count. What Roberts signaled to the American people was that Trump did nothing wrong, that he did nothing that would bar him from the presidency, that his followers also did not violate the law in some specific ways, and that he himself that Trump could not violate the law. It was an extraordinary partisan act. I think probably the most partisan act in our history, even beyond Bush v. Gore in its own way, because it not only settled in essence, or basically set the path for this election, but it changed the rules until we can revoke them for Trump and any future president to have this immunity. And in the face of that, this man, Chief Justice John Roberts, dares to cite concern about King George when he created a king in Trump retroactively and prospectively. I don't know what the oath is even going to mean on January 20th when Donald Trump swears on a Bible to uphold and defend this Constitution, a Constitution that John Roberts has said he cannot, basically he cannot commit a crime if he violates it, if he transgresses it. Even though, as John Roberts knows well, and our listeners know well, the Constitution provides that the duty of a president is to faithfully execute the law. John Roberts waved Donald Trump, waved that away almost like a pardon. And yet he comes out with this just disingenuous year-end report in which he's, focused on, claiming that people who criticize the court are acting illegitimately, that they are acting without facts, when in fact, this Supreme Court, this 6-3 over and over and over again court has made partisan ruling after partisan ruling in favor of their political party without any humility, without any restraint. And so he wants to pretend that the court is nonpartisan despite all evidence to the contrary. And then the last thing I'm going to say on this rant is he has the audacity to complain that supposedly his opponents, aren't recognizing the court's rules of cases and controversies and standing to sue, when in fact, over and over, this Roberts court has basically manufactured standing in order to issue rulings, like in the student loan case, that defy long-standing rules about standing. This court, the Roberts court, has manufactured facts, so much so that the dissent had to put a photograph, like one of the first photographs ever in a Supreme Court decision, to show what actually happened in the prayer case, in that football case, because the majority opinion was filled with lies. And so I shouldn't be surprised that John Roberts issues a year-end opinion, a pronouncement, in essence, that is sort of filled in its way with its own lies, as you mentioned, Alex, this idea that what the criticism of him is misinformation or disinformation. But the fact is that he's still the Chief Justice of the United States, and he feels that he can act with impunity. And he ends on the note reinforcing Marbury versus Madison, that it's the court's job to say what the law is. Yeah, except for this court is inventing what the law is.
Yeah.
Before Alex goes, Lisa, you know what we call a rant that goes 30 minutes or longer? A podcast.
Oh, okay.
Okay, go ahead,
All
Alex.
right. Note to self.
No, that's a good thing. I meant that as a compliment. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you ended with that invocation of Marbury versus Madison, which established the principle of judicial review, the ability of the Supreme Court to look at a law of Congress and decide that it should be superseded by the Constitution, and that the Constitution could invalidate laws. Of course, you're right, Lisa. They've completely rewritten the Constitution. And so now they are, they're not just engaging in judicial review, they're engaging in absolute judicial supremacy, to the extent that they are deciding all questions of law and policy in our country, which goes back to this, I think, really important dichotomy through which to look at judicial power, look at the constitutional framework. John Roberts in 2009, in a C-SPAN interview, talked about how, what makes the courts different from other branches is that we're not political, and that if people don't like what we do, that's more or less just too bad. And I think the other side of that, question is really encapsulated brilliantly by Abraham Lincoln when he had his first inaugural address, responding really to Dred Scott, where he said, "The candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government upon the vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers." And, if you can see the two different worldviews encompassed in those quotes, and we're very much living in John Roberts' world right now. It's more or less just too bad. And we've acceded to this idea that the court should decide all these questions. And so to your question, Popok, about, how do we, unravel what's happening in this twisted mind of the Chief Justice of the United States? I think the way to think about it is, how can he preserve maximum power as there's this push and pull, as he's got this unpredictable, chaotic president that he's empowered, that he's put back in office through his ruling on the immunity case. And I think looking at that decision and looking at the travel of that case and the other cases Lisa mentioned implicating Trump throughout this year, it was very clear that they were trying to help Trump get reelected. They saw that as the most viable path to maintaining as much power as they could, to completing what we very much view as a constitutional counter-revolution to overturn the economic and social progress of the 20th century. And now that Trump has indeed, won re-election and is preparing to reassume the presidency, he recognizes that Trump and his chaos and his complete disregard for norms and constitutional law and the status quo, it again poses a threat to him. And so he's, I think, planting this marker, right, to say, you can't defy our opinions. We're the ones that get to decide. If you don't like what we say, it's more or less just too bad.
Yeah, and so what I think is that there needs to be a paradigm shift. Although that's a hackneyed word that gets used a little bit too much, but about how. And you're writing briefs right now. You're writing some amicus briefs right now. But the way that constitutional scholarship happens at the court and the way briefs are written, I think has to change fundamentally. Right? We can't keep doing what we did in the past and expect a different result, because that's the definition of insanity. And so there has to be a more artful way to use arguments taken from and resonating with the 6 in the majority to try to get them and peel one or two off on key issues in the coming terms. The one thing we know about the writings of the Chief Justice is that you can take these things and all the other things he's ever said at oral argument, and in your own, it wouldn't be AI, it would just be your own intelligence, right? Put this into new strategies and new ways of making arguments that will be successful. And what do you think? I mean, we have to do that, don't we?
I think yes, and also, right? I think we definitely have to do that, and there will be opportunities to drive a wedge to have this majority defy Trump in some of the most extreme of these Project 2025 plans. I think, for example, the argument that these guys, Russ Vought and Mark Paoletta and others, are peddling about the invalidity of the Impoundment Control Act and inherent impoundment powers of the president. I think there's a very good chance that the court majority would not go for those, even if they agree with substantively where they're going there. And so I think there'll be lots of opportunities, and we need to look for opportunities to exploit those wedges. But I think beyond that, what we need to do, and I think that filing briefs is a good way to do that, although less to persuade the court than to persuade the public, is to make a political argument about who should have power in this country, that we should be our own rulers, that John Roberts and his buddies Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas and Amy Coney Barrett and the rest, they shouldn't be the ones that get to decide all these questions at the end of the day. And that, I think, requires a much bigger paradigm shift in terms of how lawyers in particular think about engaging with the judicial process, because we've always just accepted this idea that the courts decide what the Constitution means and that's the end of the story. But there's a long history and tradition in this country of other people, other important actors, the president, the Congress, the people themselves having a real voice in declaring and deciding constitutional meaning. And that's, I think, the direction we need to head to have a chance to overcome this court majority. Because at the end of the day, even if we succeed in stopping Trump here or there on certain policy questions or things he tries to do, the agenda that this durably entrenched Supreme Court majority is driving forward is one that is inimical to democracy. It's inimical to progress. And so we need to confront that as well.
Yeah, I want to talk more on future sort of episodes of this about that last point you just raised, which is the stakeholders in democracy, other than the Supreme Court, having a voice and a say about what the Constitution means and how, and what does that look like? What's the contours and shape of that going forward? Because I'm sure our listeners and followers are very interested, because they are, much to John Roberts' chagrin, they are informed, they are educated, and they do have legitimate criticism, but they feel like they're left out of the conversation because of the way, as you said, John Roberts has fashioned these 3 branches of government, the role of the Supreme Court. So can we do that again? Can we keep
please.
talking about that?
And that's what we're about at Court Accountability. That's sort of the thrust of all the work we try to do, from all of the research and the communications and the advocacy. You mentioned the brief that we're preparing to file. It's all sort of intended to help empower the American people to have an ownership stake in constitutional meaning.
Lisa, anything else as a final word?
I think that's exactly right. And the other thing about this court, it's not just that it's the Roberts court and they, in essence, are out of control, this 6-3 faction, but never in our history has a court been constructed in this way. In my lifetime, so since 1967, 75% of the justices put on the Supreme Court were put on there by Republican presidents. And most of those justices actually followed the precedent before them. But now we have 6 who are basically chosen in order to reverse our rights, to reverse those precedents. And in fact, at one point, there were I think 11 Republican appointments in a row to the U.S. Supreme Court because it skipped Carter. It was Nixon, Ford, Reagan, Bush. And so they have had this court this whole time, but only in this most recent period under Roberts have they had a court that finally was chosen, handpicked to basically rewrite our rights and install this Republican ideology as binding law on the rest of us. And so there are real questions in a democracy about the legitimacy of what happened, how we got here, and the moral imperative that we not give in, that we do something about it, because this is not how a democracy should function, with an out-of-control court rewriting our rights, cutting words out of the Constitution, and enthroning someone like Donald Trump as a near king. That is antithetical to what it means to live in a democratic republic under our Constitution.
I can't wait to be with Court Accountability Action throughout 2025 as we rigorously hold Donald Trump and the federal judiciary accountable. We can only do that through these kind of conversations where we always try to end, not on a high note, but on a note of a path of what we can do to make the change that is necessary in order to restore legitimacy to our constitutional republic. And I can't think of 2 better people for me to be kicking these things and spitballing with than Alex Aronson and Lisa Graves of Court Accountability Action. We're going to be doing these regularly. We all sort of pinky swore committed that we're going to be doing more of these together and with even other contributors within the world and the ecosystem of Court Accountability Action into 2025. So we'll be announcing those things as we go along. So until our next hot take, and I'm going to be doing one soon with Lisa about, we're going to talk about the TikTok upcoming oral argument and the weirdo lawless brief filed by the soon-to-be Solicitor General on behalf of the not even president-elect, as a drive-by stranger to the TikTok case, and what to make, right? And what to make. I'll send in one. Why not? I mean, okay, so there you are. So we'll talk about that in another hot take. But in the meantime, Court Accountability Action, Legal AF signing off. In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories, the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.